welcome everyone to our last event of the term on the politics of the offshore world. Today's event is titled Uncovering the Offshore World. Despite the fact that debates on offshore data are rife, I think quoting two figures from two different sources will give you an idea of the scale of what we're addressing here today. According to the NGO Tax Justice Network, up to $32 trillion are hidden assets that are held in offshore tax havens. Gabriel Zuckman, the economist who works on offshore, has calculated that about $7.8 trillion, or about 40% of corporate profits, are held in tax havens. This is just to give you a sense of the increase in outflow of money into the offshore world that has been starving developing countries of government revenues, that have been enabling kleptocrats to hide their illicitly acquired wealth, and allowing global multinational corporations to lawfully avoid paying hundreds of billions in taxes. Until recently, we lacked comprehensive and detailed academic studies for understanding the scope and the inner workings of this offshore system. This panel brings together three leading scholars to discuss their path-breaking research on important aspects of the offshore world. Beyond sharing their latest research findings on global tax havens, the global citizenship market, wealth asset management, and the informal economy, our distinguished panelists will discuss the research and investigative techniques that they have pioneered to reveal important dimensions of the offshore world. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. Let me start with Brooke Harrington. Brooke Harrington is professor of sociology at Dartmouth College. Prior to joining the faculty at Dartmouth, Professor Harrington was at the Copenhagen Business School and at Brown University. She holds a BA from Stanford University, as well as an MA and a PhD from Harvard. Her book on global wealth management, tax and offshore banking, titled Capital Without Borders, Wealth Managers and the 1%, which came out in 2016 with Harvard University Press, became a bestseller and won, amongst others, the Outstanding Book Award from the American Sociological Association. Professor Harrington has been named recently a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in London and is an accredited trust and estate planner, something we're going to go into a little bit in the panel. Kimberly K. Wang is a professor of sociology and director of global studies at the University of Chicago. Professor Wang is the author of Spiderweb Capitalism: How Global Elites Exploit Frontier Markets, which came out with Princeton University Press last year, as well as Dealing in Desire, Asian Ascendancy, Western Decline, and the Hidden Currencies of Global Sex Work, which came out in 2015. Spiderweb Capitalism provides a behind-the-scenes look at how the rich and powerful use offshore shell corporations to conceal their wealth and make themselves richer. It draws on rich interview data that uncovers the mechanics behind the invisible, mundane networks of lawyers, accountants, company secretaries, and fixers who facilitate the illicit movement of wealth across borders and around the globe. Finally, we have Kristen Surak, who's Associate Professor of Political Sociology at the London School of Economics and the author of the forthcoming The Golden Passport, Global Mobility for Millionaires, which is coming out also at Harvard University Press later this year. Professor Surak's research on elite mobility, international migration, nationalism, and politics has been published in many of the leading academic journals, but also in mainstream outlets like the London Review of Books, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the New Statement, and others. She has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, a Fung Global Fellow also at Princeton, and she has a lifetime fellowship at Clare Hall at Cambridge. So thank you for joining us today. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Let me start with Kristen, if I may. One of the issues that a lot of scholars asked about work in the offshore world, say 5 years ago, arguably they're still asking those questions in political science, which has been a laggard compared to your own disciplines in addressing these issues, which is about the data scarcity in work on the offshore world. It's about the fact that it is very difficult to access actors in this field. It's very difficult to have hard data, and therefore that work can be anecdotal, but they lack in the authoritativeness expected from the social sciences. I'd like you to start by debunking that comprehensively and by telling us how you cracked open the offshore world.
Well, I suppose I should start off by saying that the work I do isn't purely on offshore. It's really on citizenship by investment and residence by investment. So it's in a way, it's a cognate area that has a lot of overlap, and some of the people are moving in both worlds. But in some of the ways, I think that my own work didn't face as many challenges as there might be along those lines in some cases. I found it actually fairly easy to get access because there's quite a number of professional conferences for this industry. And so I started to, I went to the first one just, on a lark. I was like, whoa, there's a whole industry, a whole world behind this. And it's not, occasionally there are shoppers there, there's a lot of wealth managers, a lot of lawyers, a lot of service providers, bureaucrats, the occasional prime minister, et cetera, et cetera. So I started to go to those, and you get the due diligence companies, the real estate companies, et cetera. And you get on the circuit and you meet the same people over and over and you establish rapport, and then you go to the individual countries and you already know people who can introduce you to other people and to get in and get interviews and all of that. So ironically, I found that moment of access pretty straightforward. I would ask, go and, people are all networking, so I'd go and give them my business card and introduce my work. I'm a professor, I was, studying this. And, but of course, there's the things that people aren't telling you, which take a little bit longer, kind of sniffing around, triangulating, those sorts of things. So that question of access was very easy. But there was another thing that I suppose that my work might be slightly different to Kimberly and Brooks on this, is that I also do some quantitative work. Mm-hmm. And putting together the numbers on these programs, it's not that it's impossible. People often say, oh, the countries are terribly secretive and blah, blah. It's like, actually, you can do information requests, you can find numbers and reports online, but they don't always, they tend to be messy and they don't always line up. And so it's been working with the statistical side of this has been in some ways very rewarding, because you get an overall picture of things that nobody else is providing. You can do comparative work. But it's also very challenging, I think, just working with statistics in general, but these sorts of things as well, especially where you're triangulating things. There's a number that's been given in a parliamentary debate, but that's different from what the Ministry of the Interior is saying, which is different from a leak that came out in the newspaper. And trying to figure out what's really going on there is, I think, where my biggest challenges have been.
That's a really important point, and I'd like to emphasize for our audience that a lot of exists is open data that is just waiting to be mined. And obviously there is work, there is of difficult access that is risky, but this field shouldn't be portrayed in that way, and that what you've just said is representative of a lot of the best work being done right now. So another question, what do you think your work tells us, the work specifically on global citizenship, on inequality and global flows of money?
So that's a very interesting one in terms of what we often think about with citizenship in the first place. If we go back to T.H. Marshall, citizenship is about equality. It brings, when he was writing his, actually gave a very famous talk at the other university down the road in Cambridge about 70 years ago now on citizenship, and talking about how in a world of capitalist inequality, citizenship creates a fundamental basis of equality that enables a democracy to operate. And the world that I'm looking at is none of that at all. But that's kind of true of citizenship in general. So if you think about who goes for these programs, it tends to be people, historically it's been people with quote unquote bad passports. So, mm-hmm. If you're from the Middle East, if you're from China, Southeast Asia, Russia used to be a big demand area as well. If you don't have a lot of good mobility, there was, that was a lot of the demand. Or you don't know what's going to happen in an authoritarian regime, et cetera, et cetera. And so people strategize around this. So there's an inequality between citizenships across the world that we often don't think about if we have a very privileged one, but if we don't have a very privileged passport, we think about it a lot. And then there's intra-country inequality. So it's, it's obviously you have to be able to afford these things in the first place. And so it's that intersection of those two forms of inequality that create demand. But in terms of the intra-country inequality, it's not all oligarchs or massive criminals. Although there are some of those in, Joe Lowe, who's the mastermind behind 1MDB, has been in the papers quite a lot because he also had citizenship in St. Kitts and Cyprus through their citizenship by investment programs. But most people are actually, it would be a college-educated, highly paid tech worker from Pakistan working in Dubai who can't travel in the region to take care of his job. And so a lot of this actually ends up being quite mundane at the same time. But I think it's very useful in thinking about if you have a good passport, what are those things that you're taking for granted that you don't have to think about that other people in the world actually often do.
One of the things you say in your book is that many of the takers, you mentioned just the Russians, but also many in the global south that are particularly keen on these citizenship opportunities, precisely because of the restricted nature of the traveling and access they have under their home passports. What do you think that does to citizenship? This starting from those cases, but the broader question is, what does your work tell us about citizenship and where it's heading?
So in that sense, in this world, it's instrumental. There's not this sort of, feeling warm about the nation. There's no identity side to this. People aren't becoming a member of the diaspora. In fact, in several countries, you never even have to go to the country in order to become a citizen. People are very instrumental about this. But actually, there's been some work that's shown that people who don't have good passports or come down later on, socioeconomic, even the power hierarchy within the world, are strategic about citizenship too. And it's interesting, actually, thinking about this in terms of what's happened since COVID-19. US citizens, you get the occasional paranoid person who is into this. You get the flood of the Armageddon Americans because, a fascist Trump or a communist Biden is getting elected. But COVID-19, and suddenly people with very privileged US passports couldn't go wherever they wanted very easily, especially to Europe, shot the numbers of Americans looking for this through the roof. And so people are quite strategic about citizenship in this case. It's not about identity, it's not about national belonging. But it's also about the extraterritorial rights of citizenship. And if you think about a globalizing world, global mobility, citizenship is no longer just about the rights and privileges that it gets you within your home country. It's about what that gets you internationally. That means, on the one hand, that third countries control the value of citizenship by investment, so you get a complex geopolitics around the market as well. But that also means, if we think about globalization, I'll just go for one more thing on kind of broadening out. In a world of globalization, increased global mobility, and we're thinking about flows of money and all of that, nation states are still a very important unit for capitalism to operate, in part because they also define jurisdictions, but not only that, and they can do carve-outs and all sorts of things as well, but they also get power from defining populations. And citizenship is that way that states latch onto populations. So as long as that's the case, there's going to continue to be a demand for these sorts of programs. Just in terms of the way that capitalism operates in the world. And what that means for citizenship more broadly. So a final thing on this kind of, the patriotic, identity side of citizenship. A lot of people would still have it. So I would talk to people who would renounce, their citizenship and say, but ask where they're from, they would still go back to that. And they'd be like, but my passport's just an ID. It's not my identity.
Mm-hmm. Before I move on to Brooke, just a quick final question. One of the most surprising empirical insights from your book, much of the cast in your book of countries offering these sort of citizenship programs are what you'd expect, Caribbean countries, Vanuatu, obviously a couple of European countries like Malta, and then the recent story is Turkey, which has become a global leader quite simply overnight over the last 4 or 5 years. You can say a couple of things. It's so counterintuitive. Why is
Yeah,
that?
it's absolutely fascinating, the Turkish story. I mean, part of it was, well, they started the program, it was aimed at real estate, but it was priced way too high. It was $1 million, which, you know, you could get citizenship in an EU country for $1 million. So they dropped it down to 250,000, which is, and all you have to do is buy a nice house in Istanbul or on the coast. It's in a region where there's a lot of conflict. So a Turkish passport, you don't get visa-free access to the EU, you don't get visa-free, but it's better than a Syrian passport, it's better than an Iranian passport, better than an Iraqi passport. And so they were getting that sort of demand. What's interesting too, though, in terms of the geopolitics of it, it's slightly different because Turkey is a big country, not like, it has more than 1 million people, even in some neighborhoods of Istanbul. And so the geopolitics are quite different. So most of the countries, the microstates fall into line with US State Department demands. And so if the US will have blacklists or sanctions lists and say, okay, you can't do these people. We'll still give visas to Russian citizens, but you can't naturalize them. And the countries fall into line, but not Turkey. So Turkey will still naturalize Russian citizens right now, which is part of the reason, initially they had big demand from the Middle East, a place of big conflict. And now they've got a lot of people. They can also fly into Istanbul as well. It's half the market.
Thank you. Brooke, if I can start with a question that you've been asked many, many times. Brooke is, the most noted expert on wealth management. You actually became a wealth manager. You actually trained as a wealth manager, as it were, to infiltrate this professional community. I guess that's putting it too bluntly, but tell us about it and how you did it and what you think that brought to your scholarship.
Well, for many years, I had wanted to study the world of the ultra-wealthy. And I knew from growing up around people who were ultra-wealthy that they didn't manage their own money, that they outsourced that just like they outsourced the care of their homes and their children and their cars and everything else. So one day I realized that I didn't actually need to talk to rich people, and it would sort of be beside the point for what I wanted to know about, which was, like Kristen, inequality. Like, who makes the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? It's not the rich people themselves, they're just the beneficiaries of the work of others. And the others in this case are these professional wealth managers who describe themselves as a combination of attorney, accountant, and psychologist. Several of the people I spoke to describe themselves as social workers for the rich because there's so many socio-emotional issues wrapped up in a family fortune. And that's where all the threats come from. It's not so much from business dealings, it ends up being from, the cousin Bob's bad cocaine habit, or a daughter's habit of, marrying ne'er-do-wells who want to steal her inheritance. That all becomes the problem of the wealth manager. And one day I got a fellowship for what I thought was 9 months to go work at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. And I was only supposed to be there 9 months, but the director of the institute had just published a book of his own on wealth. So he was interested in what I was interested in, plus he had a budget of 2 million euros a year that he could sprinkle like fairy dust on anyone who wrote him a half-plausible 3 or 4 page memo. Any of you here ever submitted a real grant application?
It's not 2-3 pages.
It's like 40 pages of just dense and turgid prose. So the idea of being able to access huge pots of money, basically at the whim of one guy, if you just sort of keep him interested with a short memo, I mean, these sort of opportunities do not come along very often. And I was younger and single and didn't have a kid, and so I got the money from him to go to wealth manager training school, which was kind of like getting an MBA. It's quite expensive, and I knew it was going to cost me 2 years of my life. So basically I cut my ties to my home back in the US, naively thinking, well, anytime I want, I can go back and get a job in the US, ha ha ha, because I didn't see the financial crisis coming, which shut down hiring for about a decade. Hence my years at the Copenhagen Business School. But anyways, Max Planck Institute footed the bill for me to go to this very expensive MBA/law school-like program to train to be a wealth manager. And it was hard. Like, I worked it was, I came in there thinking, nah, I've got a PhD. How hard can this be? Accounting for rich people is really hard. Trusts, that was sort of fun. Offshore corporations, that was sort of fun. Financial investment, I could hack it, but the accounting nearly got me. Anyways, there were 5 courses, took me 2 years, graduated, but what it got me really, in addition to learning the lingo and getting me face to face with people who would never in a million years talk to someone like me, it got me entree to those professional society meetings, because unlike the people who sell passports of convenience, wealth managers don't just let anybody off the street into their professional society meetings. You have to have the credential or be studying for the credential. So that turned out to be a very valuable source of data. So I did that for about 8 years. Got the credential, ran all over the world to 18 offshore centers, interviewing wealth managers at work, eavesdropping on their professional society meetings where they would yuck it up about screwing over the poor wife in an oligarch's divorce. It was like a recurring theme everywhere in the world. And of course, they thumbed their nose at the tax man, wherever the tax man might be. And that was the genesis for my 2016 book. But there was so much data from that it's also now the genesis of a new book, whose manuscript I just turned into W.W. Norton on the 1st of this month. Hooray! Did that answer your question?
Go on, tell us about the new book.
Oh, well, when I turned in the manuscript for Capital Without Borders, that was before the Panama Papers happened. The book was actually published about 5 months after the Panama Papers, so it was the best possible sort of seeding of the ground PR campaign I could ever have asked for, because until the Panama Papers, even people in my own field, even the guy at the Max Planck Institute who dropped all that money on me, he thought, this is a very weird niche thing to study. But he was also funding people who studied the trade in rhino horns, which is fascinating from an economic sociology point of view, but very niche. And so I was off in the sort of the rhino horn quarter of sociology, like weird, probably very interesting to me, but to no one else. And then kaboom, world history intervened with the Panama Papers in April 2016. My book comes out in August 2016, and like suddenly everyone knows what I've been doing and why it actually matters. But then the Paradise Papers happens in November 2017. The Pandora Papers happen in October of 2020, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine happens, and all of a sudden everyone wants to talk about oligarchs close to Putin and how they are dodging sanctions on them, and how they've been dodging sanctions for years in the run-up to this invasion. And suddenly, wow, all this stuff I learned about how to hide rich people's money offshore becomes relevant to the news. And so this new book is about all that stuff that's happened since 2016, and a bunch of stuff I never got to say in Capital Without Borders, but always kind of wanted to write about.
Fascinating. I have 2 more questions for you, but let me just keep to the wealth managers for a second. You've contended that it is essential not just to regulate, but also sanction, not just the clients of wealth managers, but at least in some circumstances, wealth managers themselves, which your professional guild must be unhappy with that sort of recommendation of yours. But can you explain to us why you think that wealth managers should be liable in this way? They would just argue they're service providers, that they haven't committed any crime, that their sector is legal, that the strategies that they're providing, some of us may think of these strategies as immoral, but they're legal strategies for the most part. Why is that not so?
Well, the paradigm for what wealth managers do and why they should be subject, at least to what you might call export controls on the provision of knowledge. The paradigm there is not criminal activity, because you're right, for the most part, these folks are not involved in criminal activities. Maybe their clients are, like they're coming in with money that comes from drug running or human trafficking, or from looting their country in one or another criminal ways. But the wealth managers themselves are usually able to do what they need to do without breaking any laws. At least that's how the clever ones work. There's a chasm between formally and obviously legal and formally and obviously illegal. And as Professor Huang here has admirably coined the phrase playing in the gray, that's what wealth managers do. They play in the gray and they expand the gray. They have a lot of influence over like how the laws get made to create their professional jurisdiction. So the paradigm, and this is what Professor Alex Cooley here from Columbia, is it Columbia? From the Harriman Center at Columbia University, he and I published an article in Foreign Affairs back in October in which we talked about how the correct paradigm to look at this is the national security paradigm, because since just after the Second World War, there have always been export controls on the provision of very important knowledge, so that, say, understanding of how to make nuclear weapons or biological weapons or chemical weapons doesn't get into the wrong hands. So there are lots of experts who know how to do those things, and they're subject to special laws at the national level called export controls. And you might think of export controls as having to do with physical objects, but it also has to do with information. The UK last year at least tabled the idea of placing export controls on UK-based wealth managers. The US has actually done it, and I believe the EU has considered it. I'm not sure they've actually done it yet. But basically what it says is, you can be a wealth manager. Do your job, it's fine. You just can't work with sanctioned people. So you're free to practice your profession. You just can't work with these people that we specify because we have export controls on your form of knowledge.
So, Brooke, just one question there. Last week we had a wonderful event here on sort of related issues. And one of the matters that were raised was that a lot of practices are becoming less and less acceptable, even if they're not yet regulated. They're becoming less acceptable in OECD financial centers, and therefore they're migrating to financial centers such as, for instance, Dubai, Singapore. But the service providers are exactly the same Magic Circle law firms, the same Western banks, the same wealth managers. They just do it out of different jurisdictions. Would what you've just described capture the truly global character of this phenomenon, or would they just migrate elsewhere? Would they just sort of take their skills to a more permissive context?
Yes, so this is sort of like any other practice that becomes morally condemned. It heads off to the periphery. But if you keep pressing, then pretty soon the amount of periphery available in which to hide gets smaller and smaller, and it's no longer worth trying to hide in it. One of the things I found most fascinating in the aftermath of the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine was that suddenly this thing that we had been told for decades was not possible became possible, which is coordination among the leading offshore financial centers of the world to basically out their Russian oligarch clients. Suddenly you have Switzerland, Monaco, little Monaco, the US, the EU, the UK, Singapore, biting the hand that fed them by saying, okay, Russian oligarchs, be gone, scatter to the wind, we don't want you anymore. And losing a ton of money in the process. Now, if you follow matters offshore, you know, like, this is the most economically irrational thing they could possibly do, because what they traffic in ultimately is secrecy. So once you say, hey, these people are our clients and we repudiate them to protect ourselves, that's massive. And in fact, Professor Cooley here and I were writing about how a major form of sanctioning was not of the legal kind, you know, one that would come with financial or prison type penalties. It was a status penalty by saying, you know, you can't sit at the cool kids table anymore. You can't exist in polite society anymore. No one decent will be seen with you. And you might think, oh, poo, you know, who cares? They care so much. Probably the most surprising thing I learned in all 15 years of studying the offshore financial world was how thin-skinned rich people are. So imagine yourself as like a gawky middle schooler. I mean, assuming some of you were like me and gawky middle schoolers, and being like rejected by all your friends, except you have billions of dollars to throw a gigantic tantrum about it and make everybody pay. That's what you can do as a Russian or other, no, oligarch from anywhere. It's one reason they can afford to be so litigious, why they throw their money away trying to sue people into oblivion for saying bad words about them.
Brooke, one final question, and it's a sprawling one before we move on to Kimberly. The question is, you've just described the problem. Why are governments why aren't they doing more to stop abuses of the offshore financial system? The diagnosis is out. A lot of things we didn't quite understand 20, 25 years ago, when this system was already in existence, had already matured. Now, your work, the work of the panelists, Alex Cooley, Ronan Palin in the audience, we now know what's missing here. And perhaps I'm striking a note that is less optimistic than what was implicit in what you said, because at least in the UK, it's not systemic reform. It's a targeted anti-Russian vendetta, which is very conspicuously leaving all the other oligarchs in place, and the industries themselves, PR, accountancy, the law firms, the banks, they remain unscathed. So why isn't this moving even more radically towards some form of global regulation? That's the question. Again, the short answer to a very sprawling, very multi-clause question.
I can boil it down to 4 words. One of the words is conflict, no, 5 words, conflict of interest. And the other is, I can't count, I'm sorry, I'm jet lagged. 6 words. Conflict of interest and collective action problem. I'm not sure how social scientific this audience is. Obviously, everyone understands what a conflict of interest is. That just means that many of the people who are actually empowered to change the laws that would limit or constrain offshore activity are themselves beneficiaries of offshore activity. This country's former prime minister showed up in the Panama Papers, right? After wagging his finger at boy bands who were incorporating in Ireland to avoid British taxes. Remember that? Almost every country in the world has an example of that. A political leader, particularly the anti-corruption politicians, seem to be the ones who always end up in one of the offshore leaks. Andre Babiš.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The finance secretary.
Jérôme Cazuec,
Exactly.
I think was his name. And then in the Pandora Papers, a fellow named Andre Babiš, who was their, I forget, was a president or prime minister. He came into office as Mr. Populist anti-corruption campaigner, and guess who was not only dodging his taxes, but money laundering and using the proceeds to buy himself not 1, but 2, but several villas in the south of France. Nice work if you can get it. So conflict of interest. There's also a collective action problem in that putting a stop to the offshore financial system doesn't happen with 1 country acting, or 2 countries acting, or 10 countries acting. It requires something pretty close to unanimity, at least among the worst offenders or the most popular offshore havens. But why should they cooperate when they can make so much money from defecting? I don't know if that language makes sense to you, but there's this thing called the prisoner's dilemma, where you have to decide under duress whether to cooperate or not cooperate. Not cooperating is called defecting, looking out for number 1. So my country, the United States, famously did this with the OECD's most recent, the CRS, the Common Reporting Standard. So I was at this OECD event in, I think, 2017, where Pascal Saint-Amand, the czar of anti-corruption, anti-tax evasion, stood up and proudly said, we are going to put an end to offshore tax evasion by private wealth. And I was like, I hate to break it to you, man, but I don't think you're going to do that. And sure enough, it doesn't work because the United States, which is of course a member of the 38-nation OECD, refused to sign on to the Common Reporting Standard. And they knowingly did this because it meant that all the rich people who don't want to have to report the assets they're keeping in secretive trusts and so forth, they would just pick up their money from the countries that did sign on to the CRS and take it over to the United States where it could remain secret. And that is exactly what happened. And the United States just got, marginally richer because of that. So that's why there's too much money from available if you just say naughty to other countries that are involved in the offshore system, but you don't clean up your own act.
Thank you, Brooke. Kimberly, let me start by asking you, how did, in Spiderweb Capitalism, your new book, how did you uncover the offshore world?
Great, well, thank you for having me here. I kind of wish I went after Brooke because I think I might end us on a more pessimistic note than her. But I uncovered it by accident. I was very interested in Southeast Asia and interested in the question of how Western investors and East Asian investors compete when they're constrained by different laws that govern their activities abroad. So the basic US investors are constrained by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Investors coming from other countries, their governments don't have similar laws, and to the extent that they do, they're not really enforced. And I started in Vietnam and Myanmar, and as I got there, had been, I think similar to Brooke, had a very hard time getting access to people. My methods are ethnographic and interview-based, and it wasn't until I started as an assistant professor at Boston College, and nobody wanted to talk to me. Then I moved to the University of Chicago that espouses free market economics, and suddenly all the doors opened. And so while I was there, I realized that a lot of the investments going into these two markets were not onshore. They were sitting offshore in other jurisdictions, so BVI, Hong Kong, Singapore. And then I decided, okay, I'll take the information of their lawyers and accountants and company secretaries who set up these structures in that version of offshore and go to Hong Kong and Singapore and realize those are just subsidiaries of British Virgin Islands, Panama, Seychelles, Samoa. And so it really, I fell into it and never considered myself an offshore expert at the time, or I was not interested in any of these questions, and sort of then found this group of amazing scholars along the way.
And if you could tell us a little bit about your methods, how that you actually ended up using to approach this question in the book, and how you think those methods add to our understanding of the phenomenon you're interested in. I'm specifically thinking in terms of, Kristen mentioned both her work in trade conferences and her large N quantitative work. Of course, there's the deep cover work that Brooke engaged in. Where would you situate your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my methods are ethnographic and interview-based. So I traveled over 350,000 miles with people as they were raising capital around the world and then sourcing deals to deploy that capital in really remote corners of the world. Places that often are not marked on maps or that are military-controlled zones. And so I had a very hard time getting access. Initially, I started by working as an assistant to a CEO of an asset management firm. And that was great access at the beginning, and I learned a lot about what happens in the front office versus the back office, where the front office are relationship people, and the back office figures out how to execute on deals. And that's where, kind of like Brooke, I didn't go through formal training, but learned a lot of the financial language, figured out the right questions to ask. It kind of was live training. But because I'm a US citizen and because I'm constrained by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it turned out that I could not sit in on meetings or witness deals because that would implicate me in criminal activity. So after consulting with the lawyers at the University of Chicago and some of the lawyers inside of the firm, I decided to remove myself from that firm, and I also signed an NDA, so I just decided that it wasn't worth a non-disclosure agreement, which basically, a number of academics do this, where essentially, I could say a whole thing about pharmaceutical industries, where they don't publish negative results. You agree that they can vet the work before it gets published, so they're proprietary data, I mean, this is going into a whole thing about proprietary data access, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but the essential thing was that I removed myself from inside the firms, but then used the relationships and network that I built to start to interview a broader set of people. And actually what I think in the end it was serendipitous, because I sacrificed depth but got enormous and tremendous breadth. So the way that I did it is I traveled with people, and instead of sitting on meetings, I went with them to breakfast, had lunch afterwards, had dinner, and asked them to recount what happened. And so what they said to me didn't implicate me. And so those were the method. I mean, I would also say that it's very rare to be on a panel of women in this. I just did a talk yesterday at Harvard Law School, and it was all men. I was the only woman, and I just was thinking, oh, how nice, it's very nice. But as a woman doing this research, I had 13 undergraduate research assistants. 5 were with me in the field. Most were young men studying economics or public policy, and people often thought I was the student and my student was the professor. But it was a deeply, I would say, humiliating experience, because I got yelled at, screamed at, who do you think you are? What business do you have here? All kinds of sexist things you can imagine. So at the time of doing the field work, it was, I would say, quite traumatic. I often got on planes, I didn't know where it was going. We would land in some places, and then there would be a caravan of cars that would pick us up, and we would drive 4 hours, and I would think, oh my gosh, where am I sleeping tonight with this entourage of mostly men? And so I was not single, I was married, but I didn't have a child, and now that I have a child, I think about these things differently. While that was tremendously challenging, it was also enormously helpful, because I was non-threatening and got people to say and reveal a lot of things that I don't think they would have otherwise talked about. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Brooke wanted to come in there on the methods front. Brooke.
We should have a sort of symposium just about methodology. I don't know what your experience was like. You said your data access issues weren't so intense, but yeah, I think getting on planes with strangers to destinations unknown that's pretty intrepid, don't you think?
I think, Kirsten, you were slightly underselling it, because I read your methodological appendix, which is very, very, very nuanced, and there's more to it.
Yeah, I did do field work in an auto parts shop where they had all the government files of the Foundation of St. Kitts in the back room. But I think, but it's interesting, the way gender works in the field in all of this. Sometimes it can be useful, and sometimes it can be a liability.
I wanted to offer a counterpoint or an elaboration of what you were talking about, the sort of humiliation of being assumed to be subordinate or stupid or whatever. Is anyone here old enough to remember the TV show Columbo? Yeah. So if you don't, Peter Falk played this bumbling detective, and his whole shtick was to basically play dumb. So part of me was incensed at being patronized and treated to sexist language and all these things. But another part of me was like, oh, this is going to yield the best data. This is awesome. So I just was like, I went into Columbo mode, where I was like, oh, please explain my field to me. Or, please scold me for being a Marxist. I got that a whole bunch. Threatens with various forms of bodily harm, we're going to get you a young lady. And I was like, oh, tell me more. Scribble, scribble, scribble. And honest to goodness, it provided fantastic data. But you know what one of the most provocative, unintentionally provocative things that yielded great data, and in a weird way, I think just us being women in a male-dominated field like finance or sort of the arbitrage of wealth to escape the nation-state system, that's what sociologists from the late 60s would call a breaching experiment. That's an old tradition where sociologists would have their students go do things that were non-normative socially, like one of the great ones, this was by Howard Garfinkel at, I think it was University of UCLA, late 60s. He would tell his students, go home and act with your parents as if you're a guest in their home. Be super polite and see what they do. And of course, the parents liked it, but they were disoriented, like, who are you? You can gather data through breaching experiments by violating social norms. So being female in a male-dominated space or being a person of color in a white-dominated space is a breaching experiment by definition. I had white skin privilege, but you know what I was doing? I was toting an infant around and a breast pump going into these places because I'd asked, one of my cousins was a psychiatrist, and I had to go out and do some field research, and I said to him, look, should I leave my newborn baby home with my mother while I go to Shanghai for 2 weeks? He said, I wouldn't do that because babies don't understand time, and if you leave, the baby's gonna think that you died, and that could be traumatic later on. So just take the baby. I was like, okay. So if you really want to do a breaching experiment, show up in professional, financial, male spaces with a baby and a breast pump and see how people react. Everyone was very polite. Nobody said boo to me, but I think they just thought I was brainless or something. But that was great because as long as I could keep my own ego in check and not react to it, they just spilled their guts right in front of me because I thought I was too stupid to understand, or, like they were talking in front of a rabbit or something. But the rabbit was taking notes.
Kimberly, just to go back, so some of the experiences you mentioned are quite intrepid, the sinking plates to nowhere. At the same time, you underline the word mundane. Much of what goes on, especially in the context of these professional communities, is rather run-of-the-mill. These are professional routines. Can you tell us a little bit about the mundane?
Sure. I think that was the part of the work that I found most fascinating. So I interviewed asset managers, wealth managers, lawyers, accountants, company secretaries, fixers, public relations agents. And one of the things that they would highlight, and this is 2016, 2017 when I was doing the field work, so the Panama Papers had exploded, and they would say, people in Southeast Asia, the big case was 1MDB. And they would say, which was the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And they would say, 1MDB, all those cases, yeah, they're very big, they're high profile in the media, but this is just everyday business. And the phrase at the time was pay attention to the small fish, not the big whales. And when you pay attention to the small fish, you realize that this is far more mundane than we're paying attention to, and they operate with a strategy of satisficing, which is to lay low and stay small, quote unquote. And part of this is in a region where there's a high risk of being charged on charges of corruption when a new person is elected into office. They kind of let their, we were seeing this now, their underlings go on charges of corruption, and they put in new people. Sorry, I'm a little bit jet lagged and I'm thinking in Vietnamese right now, but the Vietnamese frame is little soldier, your new soldiers in place, right? And so it made me rethink what I see as charges of corruption in the media. Is it a political takedown, or is it real charges of corruption if corruption is widespread? And so, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. The question again? Where was I going?
About the, what was the question?
Mundane.
Mundane.
The mundane aspect
exactly.
of this, right. And so I think this is where I would differ from Brooke slightly, and where I'm a little bit more pessimistic, is that in the book so I theorize spiderweb capitalism. This is a structure, it's a 3D web, it's kind of a maze. It can be built in all different directions. No offshore structure is the same. So I have 2 chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 5 of the book, where I outline, one person says, maybe he has 25 different offshore vehicles, are all connected in different subsidiaries to one another. And part of why I did so many interviews was because at the time, Jason Sharman and crew were doing experimental work on offshore, and what they found was that the structures were largely very similar. And I just thought, I must be not interviewing the right people. What we do in ethnography is try to reach a point of saturation. I kept going until I hit 300, and I realized I'm just telling a different story. None of these structures are the same. And in fact, they're purposefully different in order to obfuscate each vehicle from one another. And so in the story of spiderweb capitalism, as a sociologist, I theorize it as a social web. There are these communal spiders that are feasting together, and there's dominant spiders, which are the ultra high net worth individuals, and subordinate spiders, who are the high net worth individuals, or highly compensated financial professionals who carry out the footwork. And there I would include many of these wealth managers. And in my way of articulating it, the wealth managers and the high net worth individuals bear all of the criminal and reputational risks for carrying out this work on behalf of the ultra high net worth individuals. And so we can prosecute them, and if we look at the case of 1MDB, the people that they compare themselves to is Timothy, what's the guy's name, who's married to Kimora Lee Simmons? No, the new husband. He's the Goldman Sachs executive. Why am I blanking on his name? Anyways, there was a Goldman Sachs executive who was head of the Southeast Asian desk, who was basically the fall person for 1MDB. Mm-hmm. And they see themselves as the similar type of fall person. Like Joe Low is not in jail, and none of the Goldman Sachs executives are in jail, but the people who bear the brunt of this are those whose names are there. And so the other thing I would say that I think, just because I know I'm going on now, that ethnography adds to this is that when you go into the ICIJ database, what economists have done a great job at is giving us beautiful network maps of offshore structures, how they may be connected to one another, the density. But we don't know anything about what connects two nodes in a network, or the substantive material that flows within these networks, or how totally opaque networks are connected to one another, disparate networks are connected to one another. And what ethnography reveals are the strategies, the material, how much money is there, what is this vehicle actually used for, and that, I think this is where the ethnography reveals a lot about sort of the material substance that flows between two nodes in a network, or how disparate networks are connected to one another.
Thank you, Kimberly. I have one final question, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And the question is perhaps the contradiction between this mundane dimension that you emphasized and the sheer inventiveness, innovative spirit, I would say even talent. Some of my best students ended up in wealth management. That it requires to, as you call it, play in the gray. How do we square that? This play in the gray is not just Fordian processing of same tactics. There's a lot of improvisation and a lot of technical knowledge.
Yeah, so the way playing in the gray came up over and over in my interviews. The way that you're successful in this market is that you play in the gray. What does it mean to play in the gray? You're front running the law, you're getting ahead of the regulatory system, you take things that are now regulated in developed economies, and just replicating them in less developed economies where the state doesn't have the capacity to regulate or govern those activities. But it also is flirting in this space between what's legal and illegal. And for many of the people that I studied, it's choosing the legal jurisdiction that governs their financial activities. And so what they would articulate is that, so as a sociologist, I'm very interested in the people. And so the story moved from a macro of like laying out the web and articulating the strategies for how the web gets built, which is playing in the gray, but then it also zooms into the people and their moral regimes of justification. So oftentimes people would say, sure, this is legal, but it's morally reprehensible. And while I can understand that it's morally reprehensible, I'm just a cog in the system, I can't change the system. And what I think is challenging about, to answer your question, is that the University of Chicago, 40% of our students go into finance and work in many of these firms. And in fact, at the time, they were working as my research assistants, getting paid $5,000 for the summer to be with me. The firms where we were interviewing were recruiting them for summer internships for $16,000 to $20,000 for the summer. I mean, just the multiples are hugely different. And what I find in my own students, and where I have some sympathy, is often it's the students who come from working class backgrounds who don't feel like they have the choice to go into creative work or do work of think about work as regulators, that enter into sort of low-level finance positions, hoping that they'll rise up. And actually, now that I've been there for 8 years, a number of them have. But I think the big challenge is that the private sector is just a brain drain from the public sector because the salary scales are so vastly different these days. You know, my husband was up for, I shouldn't say this on camera, but we were contemplating public office and a low level, and I just thought, even at that, like the salary, it's a sacrifice. And you know, I had spoke to a number of people. We talk about in the United States the revolving door of people who go between finance and the public sector, and part of why that's the case is that it just doesn't pay enough, and so there is this kind of brain drain. And you take the smartest, the best and brightest PhDs to make the billionaires wealthier by figuring out how to put together an algorithm that's going to move a trade that 1 millisecond faster. And so I think that is a challenge. And I would also just lastly add that if we shift the perspective, going back to what Brooke said, and I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but I'm less optimistic that we will get to a place of regulating offshore structures, because if you start from the lens of less developed economies, it's basically akin to asking the regulators to regulate themselves. If it's kind of known in Southeast Asia that state officials have fixers who are getting percent deals of shares in offshore structures, then they're not going to regulate these activities. And I think that under the Obama administration with the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, one of the big things that they said was, we need to form this trade partnership so that otherwise, weak states, i.e. China, they're gonna write weak rules of the road, undermining US leadership in Asia. And the reality of it is, with the rise of billionaires, not just in China and Russia and the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia, the United States can't compete anymore. That's the story of Asian ascendancy and Western decline. And so this idea that they're going to cooperate just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then the last thing I would say is, if we shift the lens back to the US, Delaware is the largest offshore for many non-US citizens. And President Biden, who's a Democrat, hails from Delaware. And if he can't unlock those offshore structures in Delaware, I feel very pessimistic.
Thank you, Kimberly and Kristen and Brooke, for 3 amazing contributions to this debate. And I'm just going to open the floor. Please, introduce yourselves and keep the questions relatively brief so we can get as many of you as possible.
Thank you. Great talk, all of you. I'm Matt Reynolds from the LSE, same department as Kristen. So one of my favorite things about Brooke's book is her description of the habitus of the professionals and the pocket watches and the kind of British style. And I'm wondering, question to Kimberly and Kristen, what kind of characters and performances appeared in your ethnographies?
You need a minute.
Yeah, go first. I might need a minute.
Yeah, so it's something as an ethnographer I was very cognizant of. One of the ways in which people paid bribes were through and I talk about this in my book, were highly sophisticated ways. I naively asked, I'm Vietnamese American, would ask this question, and my American side would come like, how do you pay it? Do you just give red envelopes? And I realized that was such a dumb question at the time. And they would say, no, there's a highly intimate form of gift giving, and this comes in the form of Rolex watches, Hermes handbags, art. So I think Art Basel Hong Kong is very much props up by these kinds of transactions. But they are, so if you know anything about these, I've learned a ton about these watches and handbags. You can't walk into an Hermes store and purchase a Birkin or Kelly bag. You have to develop a relationship with a sales associate by buying a whole bunch of other things, and there's tons of articles about the ratio spends, home goods, jewelry, etc., before you're offered the bag. And when you're offered the bag, you have no choice in the color of the leather or the type of leather. It could be alligator, snake, lizard, matte alligator, shiny alligator. Okay, I've obviously learned a lot about these. For Rolex watches now, you could walk into a store and try right now. You can't, it used to be the case that you would have to have a relationship for the, the Daytona, right? That was a coveted watch. What you do is you buy starter watches to get offered those watches. So it throws up the secondary market. And what happens is in these highly intimate gift-giving practices, they have a whole story of red is the color of Asia, green is the color of money, purple is your wife's favorite color, here's this gift. And then there's a secondary market in Hong Kong and Singapore where you can immediately, there's stores of value, trade them for cash right away and for much more because the secondary market is so high. And then it used to be, Johnny Black whiskey, and then it turned into this whole thing of Japanese whiskey. And so I think that kind of world of consumption is something that I was really immersed into. I would just want to say one thing, and this is not in my book, I'm thinking it might be a throw-off article. They don't pay for any of it. So my habitus changed a great deal. First of all, they don't pay for any of it because if you get one of these Birkin bags, you can basically sell it for triple what the retail is. And then over time, essentially the stuff becomes free. I mean, it's really crazy to do the math on this, but it has investment value. I mean, the return on investment is huge, and there's tons of articles on that. But the other thing is, as an academic, I wasn't dressed appropriately for a lot of these things, and so many of these people own franchises to high-end luxury, and they completely transformed my whole wardrobe. And
Did you keep some of it?
I kept all of it.
All right,
I mean, it was the wives' hand-me-downs, but also they were just like, you're not dressed appropriately, and then I would get to go in and purchase things at cost. They're called rack rates. So at cost, and my whole wardrobe changed. And for me, coming from as a first-generation, college student, then later professor, it actually fit the University of Chicago. So it was a coming of age, but I learned a tremendous amount as an outsider going in and being essentially adorned by them.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get to interact with those sorts of people who redid my wardrobe, which is all secondhand stuff, but usually from charity shops in London. But instead, I did get to go to some of these events are quite interesting. It wasn't just events; I also went to a lot of countries, so there were both sides of that. But you get there can be this wonderfully sort of imaginative libertarian rhetoric and people who believe that we should be free of all of this. And one event I would go to, they would have a big hot air balloon with passports all around it, and geodesic domes built on coasts and different places, and flying in people with helicopters. And I learned in Monaco there's an Uber chopper. You can in Monaco, if you look up Uber, there's also a helicopter version. That comes up. Yeah, that was
That's
one
so
of the events.
practical.
Yeah, just to give, traffic. But also going to the different countries as well. It was interesting, in the Caribbean, it's been a, kind of a hot spot for these sorts of programs. There's 5 countries with that. Countries do compete against each other, but they all know each other too. So thinking about habitus and that kind of form of interaction, it's interesting in thinking about the countries that, where this is a big part of even GDP. 20%, 50% or so, massive. And so you get, often in these places, the countries themselves, will have large immigrant populations, London, New York, Miami. There's a lot of intra-Caribbean mobility as well. There's free movement within the Caribbean. And then there's also, there's large Syrian populations, 4th generation, Lebanese populations, 4th generation, people of Indian descent, as well as people of, whose family members were enslaved 150, years ago or so, even more than that, nearly 200 years ago now. So you get often sort of an Afro-Caribbean middle class that's, really kind of whatever the lawyers or so who are kind of behind it as well. So it can be, it's an interesting sort of demographic. When I was in Vanuatu, one of the key informants I had was also a village chief who had to ritually sacrifice things occasionally. And I was very fortunate to catch her because she was going to meet the Pope the next week. And you get, you kind of run into these characters where you're thinking, how does this work? But yeah, I think you were better off.
I just want to add one thing to riff off of what you just said, though. I want to highlight the cultural dimension of this, because I think that when I'm in the US or even in Western Europe, labels can seem very gauche and loud and out there. And when I'm in Asia, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, broader Southeast Asia, it's a sign of Asian ascendancy, and it's a marker of that. And many of them now are invited to Paris for Fashion Week and purchase a tremendous amount as a way of signaling, right, as the West is on decline, they can't afford it. And so, there is a way of articulating it as kind of this dynamic economy, that they're on the rise, and so it doesn't have the same kind of gauche feel to it in that setting that it does when I'm cognizant as I flip between these spaces, flip around in these spaces.
Thank you, Kimberly. I think it's ironic that European luxury items that are sold at a very high price compared to their cost, in fact, it's a bit of a racket, become symbols of Asian ascendancy or valued symbols of status in East Asia. Let's move on to other questions. Or unless, Kimberly, did you want Brooke to add to that, or?
No,
No.
there's nothing I could
Okay.
add. That was enchanting.
Yes, there was indeed.
Well, I'm a bit of a civilian in this audience because my background is engineering and engineering research in energy and combustion, etc. But I had a question for you, because you all discussed this issue of wealth management in the new systems where there are lots of sanctions, etc., against, for example, Russian oligarchs and so on. Is there any evidence that that money is moving to areas where, these things are weaker? I mean,
Thank you. That's a good question. This links up to the sort of point I made earlier. I think certainly in my own work, I see a lot of money that used to go from sub-Saharan Africa that used to go to more familiar OECD or, crown colony context, going to places like Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, more permissive jurisdictions, or jurisdictions perceived as being more permissive right now, but our experts will be able to address that. Brooke, would you like to start?
Yes, so the short answer to your question is yes, but somewhat reluctantly, because more permissive often also means less secure in terms of property rights. So one of the reasons that the former British colonies are preeminent as offshore financial centers is because oligarchs from around the world, it's not just that they like the British brand the way they might put on a Burberry trench coat, they have a lot of use for the specific kinds of property protections and rule of law that the common law system can give them. So, for example, there's a gentleman at, I believe, LSE named Kojo Karam. He just wrote a really interesting book called Uncommon Wealth, in which he quotes a person as, in the wealth management field as saying, well, if you invest your money in the, I think it's the BVI, the British Virgin Islands, it's as good as putting it in London because it's safe, it's safe. So yes, you can skitter off to the periphery in the shadows. Dubai will give you more secrecy, but it's an emirate, and so if the emir takes a dislike to you, you don't get the same protections of the rule of law that you might in a more name brand offshore center.
Kristen or Kimberly? You don't have to take all questions, just in case you want to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to say everything that I've been hearing recently, especially since the U.S. sanctions against Russians, has been that Dubai has been through the roof in terms of interest. Also in terms of a place to go. So, because I'm also looking at this issue of mobility, in looking at the golden passport, global mobility for millionaires. What seems to be happening is that, so Russians can go to Turkey, they can go to Dubai, and all you need to do is get a visa. You can get a digital nomad visa within a couple of weeks. That can get you there. Then you can get a golden visa in the UAE, which they've now developed, hugely popular. And that this has really been, people living in Dubai I was speaking to recently were, actually a number of people who live in Dubai I was speaking to recently have all said it's really changed the landscape in terms of the way things are operating.
And I think that's right, Kristen. And Dubai is an absolutist monarchy, and it has previous erratic behaviors precisely, that show the discretionary power, not of the state, but of just individuals who just take a disliking to you. But in recent years, things verging from their introduction of freehold laws that allow you to buy your property and own it, whatever that means, to the expansion of the so-called Dubai International Financial Center, which is not really financial, it's a legal enclave that allows you to sign contracts, that provides for international arbitration. They're trying to make credible commitments, but it's very much, it's difficult to mimic the credibility of a common law sort of British former colony or whatever. So it may lag behind. But for the Russians, it's all they have right now. So it will have to do.
It's difficult to replace institutional legitimacy that's been built up over centuries, but the Emir, the Emirates in general, are doing their darndest.
Clara, question from our online audience?
So Les Online has asked, a recent book by Andrea Binder about offshore financing and state power identified the use of legitimate offshore financing by states with weak economies to access finance. Does this use of legitimate offshore finance also need to be controlled?
I think this is what I articulate in the book of Playing in the Gray, which is that it is much of it is legitimate. It's playing in the space of illegal activity. But what makes it so mundane is, in fact, is the fact that most of this activity is legal. And I think it goes back to your question, which is that smaller states, or I would say weaker states who don't have strong institutions, like legal institutions, financial institutions, often the only way that they can attract foreign investment into the country are through offshore structures. And so informally, when you talk with people, and I'm not going to quote anyone, but let me just say this kind of as a matter of common sense, it doesn't make sense for state officials to regulate offshore structures from less developed economies if their investors don't have faith in their legal or financial institutions to protect the inflow of capital. And so this is why Singapore and Hong Kong exist, and it's not just for illegal reasons or it's not just for purposes of hiding money, but it is actually perfectly legitimate. And that is precisely the craft of playing in the gray.
I could just tag on to there with a quick observation about what this means in terms of citizenship too, because sometimes, especially if you're in a country with a weak rule of law and you don't know, it's actually, you get more rights as a foreigner. And so there are cases where people become citizens of foreign countries, so Cambodia, Vietnam, or whatever, because you can be protected by international bilateral treaties, international arbitration, those sorts of things. You get more rights as a foreigner than you would as a citizen, which raises a lot of complicated questions about the nature of politics and inequality in the world today.
That actually includes domestic citizens who decide to round trip their investment and come into their own economy as foreign investors to avail themselves of at least some privileges that they wouldn't have as local investors.
And those round trip models were copied after China and India and other places. So, yeah.
Thank you. Please, could you introduce yourself?
I'm Yvon Guichawa, I'm studying conflict. Hi, my name is Yvon Guichawa, I'm studying conflict and African politics, so quite far away from what you do. I have actually two questions about the impact of the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, like the people you've been interacting with, like were they scared? Did they have to adjust? Did they consider this as a serious threat for their businesses or their activities? That's my first question. And also about the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, these were released by consortiums of journalists, right? So in terms of your own impact as opposed to what investigative journalists can do, do you work hand in hand with journalists in terms of the social utility of the work. Like, are journalists ahead of you? How do you situate yourself?
Thank you. And your affiliation is University of Kent?
Yes.
Yeah.
I could answer that. I think that the Panama Papers, so one thing in my book, in chapter 5 of the book, I tell the story of this guy named Will. It's a pseudonym. And he says to me, yeah, go look in the Panama Papers. There's nothing, none of the firms I control are there. But what is there are his, and he reveals this to me, are his subsidiary companies that are onshore and the names of the 3 directorates of the people onshore. And so again, this is why I think going after the wealth managers is a little bit complicated, because they are the people whose names are there. But even with the names, it's very difficult to get what's inside of the vehicle. So great, we know this person has 600 offshore companies. What are they doing? What's behind it? How much money is in it? What vehicle is connected to what? So I think for the mundane group of people that I study, it doesn't feel as threatening. And in fact, the response has been much more like, yeah, there's a guy I quote in my book who says, yeah, Obama giving a speech at the White House, like, welcome to the real world. All businesses are domiciled in one building. And even KKR or Carlyle, like the legitimate businesses in New York, it's the same story. And so this is where I don't think that it has had the impact that one would hope with the explosion of these papers, aside from the reputational risks to public figures or high-profile individuals, particularly government officials who are hypocrites in the system. But for those that are in this kind of mundane space, I don't think that it's been particularly threatening. When I published my book, I decided to obfuscate the networks and take out I don't have the names of real companies or directors, I just give the structures, because I didn't know what the consequences could be. I mean, publishing just takes a long time, and things have a new life once it's published, but even then, there hasn't really been much concern.
The people I interviewed weren't scared at all, they were angry. If you're interested in this, I published an article in a journal called Human Relations back in 2018, in which you can read pissed off wealth managers complaining about how the Panama and Paradise Papers made them look bad to their social circle. So back to the subject of status, it shamed them as a profession, and they felt that that was very unjust and undeserved. And they had a variety of, I identified 4 different sort of moral rationales that they used to respond to the changing framing of what is legitimate. So back to the question that was posed online, what about legitimate uses of offshore? Well, the concept of legitimacy, by definition, is socially constructed. It's sort of what sociologists study, is like how it gets constructed. This also addresses your question about how what we do is different from journalists. I used to be a journalist, so I feel like I have a foot in both worlds. It is not a journalist's job to talk about sort of these high-level conceptual issues. The journalist's job is to report the facts and let the public who reads them draw their own conclusions. You have to carve out for a minute the idea of the opinion section or the editorial section. But that's not what a reporter is supposed to do. Other people do the editorials and the opinion pieces. It's just the facts, ma'am. What we do as sociologists or social scientists in general, we're not supposed to tell people what to think, but we're able to put things in a much broader context. Like, here's this new thing, the Panama Papers. What other things is this like that will help us understand what we're seeing here and what its true significance is? So the concept of playing in the gray, that is a useful concept. A journalist would never produce something like that because it's not their job. And they don't have the leisure to sort of step back and take the view from 30,000 feet. That's our job, to say, oh, there are lots of things you could look at as playing in the gray, and they're not just offshore finance. So you can connect the dots to multiple phenomena and see the big picture that they form.
Yeah, I get called up by journalists quite a lot who, they're generally going for the big sexy story that's going to be, a headline piece, and it's, somebody's really bad who's gotten citizenship by investment, basically, and there's cases of that for sure. But for me, I want to know, it's very similar to what both of you are describing. I want to know how this market works. How is it that citizenship can be a commodity? How does that work? How's that possible when the sovereign is the rule maker and the sole producer? How do you trust what's going on in that market? What's going on behind demand? What is this whole web of intermediaries? Most of it, you go up and you want to invest in citizenship in some country and you think you're dealing with one person, and you don't know there's probably actually at least 4 or 5 different, companies with different carve-outs doing, stuff in this whole market. Journalists don't care about that. they want the Joe Low at 1MDB story. And so I think in trying to understand, and what's I think interesting also from the sociological perspective, when you do that 30,000 feet overview, you also understand a lot about the way the world works today. And the journalists are also not going to give you that either.
One thing I want to add that I just, riffing off of what Kristen said, is that academics operate differently in that journalists often cite their sources and name names of people, and academics can interview a large number of people and offer anonymity as a way of trying to understand a phenomenon. So I'll give you one example that just came up in the New York Times yesterday. There's this great story of super fake handbags. And if you're very interested in this, there's this New York Times journalist who went through the process of procuring super fake handbags to try to tell the story about how the secondary resellers can't even tell the difference, and in fact, sales associates in those stores can't tell the difference. And she has this whole thing. So she says, okay, there's a whole chain that it goes through if they're manufacturing in China and they're shipped from somewhere else, and she goes through this. Well, one consequence of that is now a bunch of people have reported her for being engaged in illegal activity, for trafficking goods illegal goods across borders, right? And so there's been this whole Reddit thread of people basically reporting her. Whereas an academic would say, if we're really interested in understanding this phenomenon, but we don't want to put any of the people that are telling us these stories at risk for the sake of knowledge and expanding our understanding, anonymity means something. And there's big debates in academia right now about data transparency and replication, and particularly assaults on ethnography, but even on quantitative work that we can have a discussion about. But I think that's one sort of difference, I would say, between academics and journalists.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Unless there's another one and we can wrap them together, or no, that's it.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's been so interesting. And I just wanted to riff off of what you guys were saying about motivation and how that differed to journalists, maybe. And I wanted to ask whether your motivations were primarily kind of under that understanding or that impact. I mean, I have the sense that it's mostly understanding, but is impact also at the forefront? And how do you it seems to me that maybe journalists are more interested in impact, but then their spaces are different to yours, and I'm just wondering how those things interact for you all.
That's a good point. I do think I think that, especially in the UK, where the language of impact is used at universities all the time, you have to be impactful. But I think you're right that in terms of impact, it's quite different. So a lot of the journalists I encounter are working very closely with big supranational organizations or certain governments or whatever in order to try to get a political agenda across. Whereas I think in terms of the sort of impact I've done and can do, it's more in understanding how this works. If you're going to regulate it, then you need to know how things work on the ground. Otherwise, your regulations are not going to work. And because especially what I do, it's so hyper-politicized because people have very sentimental notions about citizenship and these sorts of things. So that I think that does skew some of the debates. Not to say that there aren't a lot of issues, but that gets wrapped into it as well. It's a sexy policy thing to wave. Where European values are not for sale, and you're kind of like, what does that mean? I don't know. But if you're going to regulate, then know what's going on. Don't go in with your assumptions about the way the world works in the first place. And I think that's what academics can do as well.
I really appreciate your question, and I'm not in the UK, and so I don't know what impact means in this, so I will just go
No one
for
knows.
motivation. Sort of what your question about motivation. And I think that one of the things that constrains journalists, and I deeply respect their work, and I think in many ways they are ahead of academics. I'm thinking of Nori Prims, who has all of the stuff on quantitative easing and looking at the role of central banks. It's deeply historical, really well thought out work, is that they are looking for a villain in a story. And when you are doing a quick, expose, there's a villain. And I think that when I think of spiderweb capitalism, one of the things that I struggled with a lot in trying to do a crossover trade book is that with a crossover trade book, they want to follow a kind of journalistic, practice, which is, okay, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, who do we go after? And as an academic, I think we have the luxury to step away and, as Brooke said, have this 30,000-foot view. And as Kristen said, really think about the systems and try to tell a story that's about systems, which means that the policy impact is not one where the question that I get a lot, that I dislike the most is, well, what are the policy implications? Or how can we fix this? And the answer is, it's a systemic problem that crisscrosses multiple sovereigns, that requires a kind of collective action that Brooke articulated, which we don't have because we don't live in a world where nations are not in conflict with one another. I mean, as a daughter of Vietnamese refugees, the Southeast Asian region is a region that the US, Russia, and China have been competing over for centuries. And it's also a way in which they're raising capital now, right? I mean, that story of, old age mines that were there under British colonialism that can now be mined with new technologies, right? I mean, this is the new frontier. And so I think what I really hope we do as academics is to really paint a systemic story to try to get at this. So my motivation as being a mother of a 2-year-old daughter is really wanting to understand systems of inequality, not just the consequences of inequality. And to see myself as playing one very, very small part of a larger group of people that are trying to attack this at multiple angles, but there's no villain, just as there's no academic or journalist heroine in the story. And we could talk about journalistic celebrity and academic celebrity, but I don't think that is my motivation.
Brooke, you have the last word.
I would like to examine the premises of your question for a moment. One is that journalism is primarily about impact. One of the reasons I left journalism was because I'd gone in thinking, I'm gonna make a difference in the world. I'm gonna show people the truth, like Woodward and Bernstein. And what I found was it was an industry that was becoming more and more tabloid-esque, you might say. If it bleeds, it leads. I had a bureau chief at Associated Press who actually said to me with a straight face, "Here we process the news." And I was like, dude, really? That's what you think we're doing here? And I realized that the field that I thought I'd entered was not at all what I was expecting. It was not about impact. It was about selling attention, garnering attention and then selling it. And of course, you've seen this explode with social media and so forth. It's sort of a P.T. Barnumization of the news. And I couldn't engage in that. So one of the dimensions I think has been missed in this discussion is the impact of the financialization of everyday life, the colonization of the life world by the business, the commercial institution, the idea that everything should be reduced to dollars and cents. Academia is still a slightly sheltered place where you don't have to care if what you're doing is making money. Although I think especially in the UK, with the ref system, it's becoming less and less like that. The commercial logic is imposing itself more and more on academic work. But here's why that matters. Even as a journalist, if you find a story that's going to have a lot of impact or you think it's important for people to know about, it's not going to get published if it's not going to sell. So, the J. Lo story, That's a People magazine kind of story. That's tabloid-esque. And yeah, you kind of sneak some news in there, but the packaging.
Yes, Leonardo DiCaprio, Miranda Carr, that had a cast of Hollywood celebrities that you could add
Yes,
to it.
yes. So the news, it has to be wrapped in a sugary wrapper of saleable, easily digestible stuff. So if you really want to know how things work, you can't really be a journalist because nobody wants to spend the money on actual investigative journalism anymore. I was invited by the Guardian newspaper, the allegedly lefty newspaper, right, to submit a column to, they had a wealth column. And I was going to write about sort of the moral corruption of elite philanthropy. And they were like, oh, that's very nice, but we can't publish that because we're funded by the Ford Foundation. I'm like, well, this is exactly why I left. So in my little walled garden, it's not really an ivory tower, but like in my little sheltered space where I don't have to be buffeted by the forces of the market, where my undergraduates, 20, 21-year-olds walking out of Dartmouth make more money than I do as a professor after 22 years. But I'm okay with that because I get to ask the questions that I think are interesting and I get to investigate them in the way that I think is right. And I get to write what I think is the truth. Not to say that I have any kind of lock on the truth, but I call them like I see them. And nobody can tell me, oh, you can't publish that because it's not saleable or the funder won't like it. And that means a lot to me. I'm willing to trade lifetime income for that.
Thank you, Brooke. This has been a fascinating and inspirational panel. I'm delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.